One of my earliest memories, I was 5 years old, and my parents had just relocated us from Southern California to the Willamette Valley, the Valley of Willamette, Salem, Oregon. We were living in this apartment complex, and there was a big field beside these apartments, and I used to play in that field, and there were garter snakes in the field. And I remember one day I was concealing myself in the tall grass of the field. I don't know if I was hiding from my mom or if I was hiding from some kids, but I know that I was hunkered down in the grass, hiding from somebody. And right beside me, these two snakes came up and they twined on themselves and raised up. It's that symbol that you see that's associated with medicine. I forget what it's called. It might be called caduceus, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure if they were mating or if they were wrestling, because male snakes do wrestle against one another for territory and for women in that same manner. In any case, I was just blown away. Something about it to me was really magical. And it locked in my memory even to this day. I've seen snakes do some other things that, similarly were just wondrous to me. Like, for instance, I was in East Texas one time. I was in this little town, and I was just walking down the road. It wasn't even in the town. It was kind of like on the outskirts of this little one-horse town where there was kind of like these farmhouses here and there. And East Texas is almost like Louisiana. The way it looks is a lot of pine forest and swamp and this kind of thing. And I crossed over this small bridge over a creek, and when I looked down at the creek, there were water moccasins. It was almost like they were dancing. They were raised out of the water. Just maybe a half of their body was in the water, the tail half. But as much as they could, their body was out of the water, their head was pointed, and they were like racing up and down the creek, and there were dozens of them. I have no idea what was going on. When I was 8 years old, I saw in the pet store, in the mall, in Lancaster Mall in Salem, Oregon, I saw boa constrictors in the pet store. Beautiful baby boa constrictors. And I asked my parents if I could get one as a pet. And my mom is really afraid of snakes. She didn't want to tell me no. So what she told me was, if I raise on my own, completely on my own, without any help from them, if I raise half of the cost of the snake, which was $50, the snake was $50, so I had to raise $25 at 8 years old in 1979, 1980. If I could raise that $25 on my own, then she would chip in the other half and buy me the snake. She never thought I could do it. It took me 2 weeks. I went door to door, my neighborhood, and asked if I could weed their planters and gardens and this kind of a thing for $1. $1, I'll weed all your weeds. And eventually I made myself the $25, and I got the snake. And that snake I brought home, and that first day I made a bath for it in my washroom sink. And I think I made it too hot, because I put the snake in there and it started writhing around. And then I took it out and put it in the tank that we had got for it to live in, and it just started writhing on itself. And I sat there and cried, and the snake, the boa constrictor, died after an anguished hour or so of turning on itself, or at least it seemed like an hour to me. And then a couple of days later, it might even been the next day, I don't know, but my parents took me to a different pet shop and bought me another boa constrictor baby. And this one was a problem snake at the pet shop, because it always escaped whatever enclosure they had it in. And indeed, the morning or the day that we went to go get the snake, it had escaped the enclosure, and they found it on top of some bird cages. Brought it home, was very careful not to hurt this snake, and it stayed with me until I was almost graduated from high school, at which time I knew I was going to be leaving for military service soon. And so I put an ad in the paper and ended up giving the snake, which was now by that time about 10 feet long, to a female cop who also had a fondness for snakes. So I raised that snake. That was my pet. And in order to feed it, I ended up raising mice, or rats rather, in my garage. I had tanks and tanks full of rats, so many rats. I was breeding that my dad would sell them to the pet stores for feeder rats for other people with snakes. In raising the rats, of course, there was the occasional rat that I had a close bond with. One of them in particular, one of the earliest rats that we were keeping, was was named Mickey Rat, and he lived a good long while, and it was very sad when he died. Rats are actually very good pets. And I raised garter snakes. I had a 50-gallon tank where I used to collect garter snakes and keep them for various lengths of time. I had some of them breed in captivity. And whenever I could get my hands on a lizard or some other kind of snake, I would. I remember one time when I was maybe 10 or 12 years old, going on an airplane to visit my grandparents in Phoenix, Arizona. And on the flight back, I smuggled this little red snake and a fence lizard in my pocket. I smuggled them back to Oregon. And now, today, decades later, I am a rattlesnake wrangler for the city where I live. There's a program in this city of Lethbridge, Alberta, where, because we have a population of prairie rattlesnakes in the river coulee surrounding the city, these rattlesnakes end up coming into people's backyards, front yards, what have you, houses, garages. And this conservation-minded guy, Reg Ernst, decided to start a program for picking up and relocating the rattlesnakes that ended up in conflict with humans. And the other year, when after a decade of running this program, building it up, getting it to the point where people knew about it and were very conscious of rattlesnake conservation in Lethbridge, and would almost all of them, rather than killing the snakes that they encountered, would phone the hotline and have somebody come and pick it up. After a decade of building that program, Reg abruptly had to move north to Edmonton, which is about 7-8 hours away. And so somebody needed to take over the program, and he phoned me and asked if I would do it. He knew me as a naturalist, and he knew me as someone with an affiliation for snakes, who was aware of the hibernacula dens and all this kind of thing. So he offered it to me, I took it, so now I am the lead rattlesnake wrangler for Lethbridge, Alberta. And in the summer season, I might pick up 60 snakes. 60 snakes that otherwise would have most likely been killed in another scenario. And the reason they would have most likely been killed is because culturally, snakes have been demonized in a manner that most people have a real deeply entrenched fear of a snake and will run away screaming from any kind of encounter they might have. never understood this. Why is the snake a symbol for something that's bad or evil, and why do people fear it? Psychologists have attempted to, and successfully, to convince people that our fear of snakes is a naturally evolved trait that is common to primates. And they've done this by demonstrating that different apes and monkeys will recoil in fear if you put a snake into an enclosure with them, or even a fake, like a rubber snake. And the suggestion is that because many species of snakes are deadly poisonous, that we have, as primates, developed this innate fear of them. And I don't know if I buy it. It might be partly true. You know, certainly the first encounters that I had with rattlesnakes, I recognized immediately how powerful they were, and I did have an adrenaline reaction. I wouldn't call it fear, because I was, of course, being me, I was fascinated. Right? I didn't run away. I got closer. I got as close as I could. You know, that I felt that I could without getting struck. But I did, you know, but my heart was racing, because they're clearly very powerful. And I don't mean powerful in a sense that just that they're dangerous. There's more to it than that. Honestly, I believe that snakes can read your emotions, your feelings, your most honest, you know, the things that's going on inside of you. I think the snakes are aware of that. And if anything, I think maybe that is what has contributed to their demonization. Because in the everyday, most people are putting on an act of how they feel about things, about others, about what they're doing in life. You know, there's a lot of times where we're concealing our true feelings because it would be, you know, socially disruptive to reveal them. But I think that snakes, in my time that I've spent with snakes, I think that that's the level at which they communicate. And that they can read whatever's true of you in the moment. And they respond to that. And it frightens people. It's incredibly frightening to people to have that, to become aware that the snakes are aware at that level, and then that fright that occurs ends up being contagious, because the snake then in turn becomes afraid of the person who's afraid of them. And so for most people, for instance, it would be a big mistake to handle rattlesnakes or any poisonous snake, because they have that fear of the snake's power, and that fear, the snake is going to respond in kind to that fear and be afraid of the person and very likely bite them. It's only when you are comfortable with that kind of intimacy that you can handle poisonous reptiles safely, in my opinion. But there has been, a lot of demonification or demonization of these creatures. And one of the real mysteries that I have played with over the last several years has been trying to wrap my head around or understand or see through read the encryption of some of the earliest mythologies or origin stories that involve the snake and what's going on there, because at the very earliest, in the very earliest stories, like for instance in Genesis of the Christian origin stories, Eve, the first woman, is tempted by a serpent, by a snake, apparently, to eat the fruit of a tree of knowledge, and when she does so, it ruins the world. Her and the first man, Adam, and they're likely the moon and the sun. Although, that's been, if that's the case, it's been concealed. But in other origin stories that have similar elements from indigenous cultures, it's the moon and the sun. What was it? What was that snake about? And why is it that, they were living in such beauty and, real, like, paradise? And then, because she partook in some kind of knowledge that the snake led her to, that ruined everything, so that really every human life on the planet afterwards was a wreck, they enter in with, supposedly with sin, whatever the hell that is. It's like people are evil by nature now, because about this event that occurred when the snake led the moon to this fruit of the tree of knowledge. I mean, there's something underlying this story. I mean, all of these elements are very, very important. And what are they? I haven't a clue. You know, I have a clue that Eve is the moon. I have a clue that Adam is the sun, just because in the other cultural stories of indigenous peoples that have this thing go on with the serpent, it is sun and moon stories. For instance, the one that I am obviously most familiar with is the Blackfoot story. The story that supposedly is the origin story of the Skitsagumix, the Big Dipper, but I have my doubts. There's another story involving a bear that I suspect is the real Skitsagumix Big Dipper story. And there's two ways of representing these 7 stars in Blackfoot iconography. One of them is very, makes it look like the Dipper, like the Big Dipper in the sky. And I think that's associated with the bear story. And the other one is associated with the story I'm about to talk about. And the way of representing those 7 stars is in a crescent shape of the new moon. And in this story, this is a pre-human story. This is the earliest of all the origin stories. It's a sun and moon story. And supposedly, this takes place on Earth, where supposedly there has been a population of earthly inhabitants that are monsters, that were serpentine. That the first life actually that was created here by the sun, prior to the sun's engagement with the moon at all, the first life that was created here was this reptilian life, and that they developed into these kind of monsters who had forgotten about the sun, their relationship to the sun. And so as a kind of, to almost to wipe the slate clean, but at the very least to kind of reduce the influences of these reptiles on the planet. The sun supposedly made the earth boil from inside and basically cook all of these reptile monsters. But there were the odd small ones that got into crevices in the rocks that were deep enough and situated just such that the lava and the heat didn't reach them, and they survived. Some number of them survived, and out of those came the reptiles that we know today. smaller reptiles were re-inhabiting the planet. This is when the sun took up with the moon. So it may have been that at the time that if people that are trying to put this into some kind of historical narrative suggest that those first reptile monsters were the dinosaurs, and that the dinosaurs were then some cataclysmic event occurred on the Earth that is associated with the sun, and basically cooked all these dinosaurs, and at that point the moon came into existence. Maybe the impact of a large meteor that scientists suggest occurred to kill the dinosaurs, maybe that impact created the moon. I don't know. But in any case, after the big monster reptiles were taken care of, then the sun takes up with the moon, and they are living on Earth, and they have 7 children, all boys. The youngest of these boys is named Raw Man, and they're living well. They're enjoying life. The moon does women's work during the day, meaning she goes out and she gathers roots, berries, plant foods. She stays close to the camp. She cooks. She takes care of the home. Takes care of babies. The son and his boys go out hunting. And in the course of this living like this, the moon becomes lonely. And this is a theme that occurs again and again in Blackfoot stories. Whenever you have a family living out on their own, away from a camp of other people, the woman becomes lonely. And at that point, there is a snake man who decides to try to charm her, and transforms himself into a humanesque being and approaches her, and it's very shocking to the moon to see this other person there. She didn't know that there was any other beings like her and the sun and their children on the Earth. And so at her first encounter, she's just absolutely shocked, and she recoils. In subsequent encounters, but she doesn't tell her husband about it. And then in subsequent encounters, she's less intimidated and more inquisitive, and starts to communicate with this being, and then eventually starts becoming kind of intimate in those communications, where she's learning about who he is and their life and stuff, and is very shocked to learn that this history of the sun killing off, these earlier beings who are the ancestors of this man. And so he's basically slowly convincing her to consider ideas that her husband might not be as good of a man as she has always thought him to be. And eventually the two of them become physically intimate. And at this point, after the first occasion on which they become physically intimate, the son intuitively knows that something is wrong. He can smell it on her in their lodge that evening, in her behaviors, in her manner. He can smell it on her. He knows something's wrong, and so he devises a plan to find out what's going on by acting like him and the boys are going out hunting, when in fact he himself turns back to camp and hides in the brush and waits to see what kind of things his wife is doing all day. And he follows her, and she goes to this log, and she raps on this log, and she uses a stick, knocks on this log, and this snake, and it's described as having many legs, slithers out, and as it comes out of the log, it transforms into that humanesque man. And then that afternoon, she has sexual relations with that man, and the son is watching the whole time from a concealed position. And at this point, he decides that the moon is evil for doing this, or at least that's the way the story is often told now, although I kind of feel like the concept of evil is something that's introduced by Christianity. In any case, the son plots to do something about what's happening, and he confides in his boys about what he's seen and about his plans, and he gives each of the 7, a magical item that they will use, that they might use later to protect themselves, because the son's plan is to kill the moon's lover and then to kill the moon. But there is a chance, if he does not destroy every part of them, there's a chance that one or the other can come back to life within 4 days of killing them. And in that case, the boys might need protection, and so he gives them each a gift to use. To the youngest son, Ogina, Rahman, he gives a bladder bag full of water. One of the other sons also gets a bladder bag full of water. One gets a bladder that's full of air. One gets a stick. One gets a rock. One gets a skin of a very colorful bird. They get these magical items, and the son includes them in his plan. And so one morning, when they're supposed to be heading out to go hunting, they go instead directly to the log, knock on the log, and when the serpent creature with the many legs slithers out, the son chops off his head, and killing him, and he slithers out, and he's laying there dead, and the son kind of lines his severed head up with his body, and they leave him there, and they hide brush. And soon enough, the moon, the woman, comes to the log and she finds her lover decapitated. And she's horrified. And also enraged at the same time. And she runs back to her lodge screaming. And then she runs back to her serpent lover again. And she lays on his body. And she's crying in anguish and laying on top of him, holding him. And that's when the son and the boys jump her and cut off her head, and then proceed to cut off her limbs and cut both her and her lover into many small pieces. And then they pile wood around and on top of them and create a huge bonfire and burn them. And they stand around the fire with otoyatsis, with what would you call it, forked sticks, so that any ember that flew out, they could pick it up with the forked stick and throw it back into the fire. And they wanted to burn up every little bit of these two and burn it to white ash, so that they would be assured that they would never come back. So they waited at the fire until it was all burned out, and we're pretty sure that they got all the pieces, all the little coals and stuff that might have taken air, but you couldn't be absolutely sure. And so they went back to their lodge, and they were told they were gonna have to be cautious for over the next 4 days. If any of those little pieces got away, then they could be brought back to life. And to me, you know, what I find very interesting in this aspect of the story is it's not unlike cloning, where all you need is one little piece of that life that contains the DNA that can bring this creature, this being, back into existence. And they wait, and sure enough, on the 4th night, they hear a raging scream and something rushing toward their lodge, and they know it's the woman, the moon, and they run. They make a run for it. And as they are running and the moon is on their heels, the son tells his oldest boy to throw back a rock, and the rock that he'd been given. And the boy throws it back behind him, and the mountain range crops up. It's the Rocky Mountains, and separates them from the woman. And the moon, she ends up running back and forth along the mountains, trying to find a way around them, and can't find a way around. And eventually she calls on the ants, the insects, the ants, to chew a cave through the mountain that she can get through. And this is over a long period of time, but she does get through the mountain and resumes her chase, and eventually is catching up to the boys again. And when she is, then the son tells his next oldest boy to throw back that stick. The boy throws back that stick, and a forest of timber emerges between them. And again, the woman runs back and forth along the timber and can't find her way through. And then decides to just go straight through. And though the timber rips at her, rips her clothing off, tatters her, rips her skin, she eventually gets to the other side of the timber. And actually, I did kind of mess up the story. In between the mountain and the timber, there was a son who threw back the first bladder bag, and it created it was a bladder bag full of water, and it created like heavy rains, and the woman couldn't find good purchase in the ground to keep running. But eventually the rain stopped and the ground's dried, and she was able to resume her chase, and that's when the stick was thrown for the forest. And when she got through the forest, then the bladder bag full of air was used, and this created a strong wind that blew her backwards away from the boys. But eventually the wind died down. She resumed her chase, and the next magical item to be used was a finger. The line was drawn, and from that line, the river Cooley Canyons emerged, separating her from the boy. And she had to go all the way down the Cooley to the river, all the way back up, resume her chase. And after that, let's see, we had the rock, the first water bag, the sticks, the wind, the finger. After that, the beautiful bird was used, and that created an electrical storm, lightning and thunder, and frightened the hell out of the woman. She had to seek shelter to hide from the lightning. But eventually the storm died down and she resumed her chase. And then there was only Raw Man's gift remaining, the other bladder bag full of water. And when the woman was on their heels and she was yelling, she was screaming that she was going to kill Raw Man, he was told to throw back that water. And when he did, a separation, an ocean of water came between them. It's described as an ocean, but in language, it's the water that's above. And what it's talking about is the atmosphere. And in fact, in the story, the boys, in being across the ocean, were actually in the sky, away from their mother, the moon. They were in the sky. And so was their father, the sun. They were no longer on Earth. They were in the sky and separated from the moon, who was still on Earth, by an ocean of water. And that's the atmosphere. And the moon, at that point, used a gift that the sun had given her, a powerful, magical gift that the sun had given her, which is sabutsimo, which is the sweetgrass smudge. And on the scent of the smoke, she rose up through that ocean and got back in the sky world, where she was going to resume her chase. But as soon as she emerged in the sky world, the sun was there to meet her, and he chopped her leg off. And this was, although he severed her leg, and there's a word in Blackfoot for the moon that's literally severed leg. But she's also called Kokumakisum, the night sun. More often called Kokumakisum, the night sun, or Kipitaki, the old woman. But her leg was severed and she was bleeding. And the sun told her that her leg would grow back. But by the time every time her leg grew back and she was full again, her leg would be chopped off again. And she would bleed in these cycles. And so she continued her chase, and her leg would grow back, and every time it would grow back, it would be severed again, and she would bleed. And this is the condition that all women inherit from the moon, that on a cycle with the moon, they bleed. So this is the story of the origins of these 7 stars. And it's mostly understood as the origin of the Big Dipper, although, like I said before, I have my doubts. What if, instead of the origins of the Big Dipper, this is the origin story talking about what if the 7 stars are planets? And in fact, Ogina is sometimes recognized as Mars. What if the 7 stars are the planets and the ancestral Blackfoot were aware that there was the Earth and these 7 other planets, and they were all the children of the sun and moon? It's a possibility. I have seen these 7 represented most often in the shape of a crescent moon. I have also seen it represented in a straight line of 7, and I don't know if that's the same. But I'm very confident that the crescent moon representation is. And there are also 7 winter moons. And winter is, in Blackfoot territory, the kind of the gauge of, or the prototype for danger, for periods of danger. Because it's the winter that's the harshest time of the year. So you have 7 winter moons. And you have these 7 gifts that were given to each of these boys that were deposited on Earth that created basically the protective homeostatic mechanisms on Earth that ensure that life here will persist in spite of the threat that is looming, that is the alternate of the sun, that is the cold, that is the winter. And those 7 homeostatic mechanisms are the same things that climate scientists today are monitoring in the changes that we're making via global warming, and they recognize that these homeostatic mechanisms are going to and are already doing their job to balance out our impacts on the climate. And in doing that job, they might very well kill us. So there's all these things embedded in the story, but the thing that I really don't understand and that's I've been grappling with in my mind is the snake. What is this snake? What is this serpent thing? Clearly, this is similar to Adam and Eve, where the snake corrupts the first woman, and because she is corrupted, all hell breaks loose, changes life on this planet forever. What is that snake? A friend of mine recently proposed that that snake is the sun bringing planets into orbit. To me, that explanation is not intuitive enough, does not match the stories at all in a way that makes any sense. Maybe if you consider that the seven and the earth are all planets, but why is the snake bad, and what does it have to do with tempting the moon and all of this garbage? Why are those orbits, if those orbits are reptilian, why are they bad? You know, who has ever seen a snake in that perfect circle? I haven't. I don't know. To me, it's just, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't put anything together for me. There's no gestalt sensation within that proposition that the snake could be the orbits. What does that snake have to do with knowledge? And why does it so drastically change life on this planet and the human condition and all of this? I don't. To me, it doesn't seem like that's the answer. You know, I look at other things. You know, how are snakes depicted in other stories, in other origin stories? There's Blackfoot's story about there's a hero, not unlike like Hercules or something like this, in some of the stories, named Catoyus, who goes around slaying monsters and such. And one of the monsters that he slays is a family called the snake family. And although this story is very clear that these are not actual snakes, but people that have qualities of snakes, and the exact quality of snake that they have is that they do things, underhanded things, in a concealed way. They hide themselves and steal from other people, steal from people that they are in fact living with, that are their kin, that they're supposed to be in a reciprocal, beneficial relationship with. They approach those relationships dishonestly. They hide their true intentions and they steal. They gain. It's all for their benefit and not for other people's. And they drink. They drink choke cherry wine. And so Catoyus one day goes into their lodge when they're all there, walks right up to the head of their family, who has several wine, I think it was 3 to be exact, that number might be important, 3 wine skins laid in front of him, and Catoyus drinks from one of those wine skins and then immediately draws his knife and cuts the throats of the people in that lodge. One woman runs away in terror, and he calls out after her that from now on there will still be snake-like humans that will come from her in the future. And the lodge itself became the snake-painted lodge that still exists today. That is like a bundle that is transferred. In many of the Blackfoot stories, even though something is depicted as kind of like a monster or evil or something like this, once it is once its power is taken by people, it can become something that's useful for people. So there are still these lodges belonging to the beings that Katoyas killed, and the songs and stuff that go along with those lodges, and the power of those people to be so successful at their sneaky ways is something that can still be used. So snakes are considered in the culture sneaky, underhanded, and this, I think, is a depiction that goes across several other cultures, and maybe is universal. I don't know. Snakes are concealed. You don't see them, and then they're there and they do something bad to you. You know, that might be connected with the things that the psychologists are talking about, why people are repelled from snakes. But what does that have to do with the snakes being associated with some knowledge? In the Blackfoot story, the Sun and Moon story, it's very clear what that knowledge was. The snake told the moon about the history that she didn't know about, that the sun never told to her, that the sun may have hid from her. He revealed to her the history, and that's what turned her against him, turned her against the sun, knowing that past. That's the knowledge that's explicit in the Blackfoot story. What does the snake have to do with that? Other than that the snake, that the reptiles are the earlier life form, and so they are more aware of that history than any other animal. To me, that's the only connection so far that I can make that explains why the snake is associated with knowledge, why the knowledge is associated with something bad happening. Because suddenly, rather than being perhaps in the moment, rather than perhaps being where she is, with who she is at the time she is, the woman is concerned with a past that in a sense no longer exists, but for the snake reminding her. So, in speaking about this, really, that's the first time that idea has come to me. That, you know, literally what's talked about in the Blackfoot story, that there was this population of snakes beforehand, that the snake that charms the woman is a representative of that population that escaped after the sun attempted to murder them all. That the knowledge that he's sharing with the woman is a knowledge of the history that she didn't know, that she wasn't aware of, that turns her against the people that are her family. That takes her out of the moment and who she is, and gets her concerned with who she might be if this history is correct. It's very interesting. I'm glad I made this video, because it's the first time I've actually thought about this. And the first time I've had any inclination of why the snake is that one who reveals this kind of knowledge to the woman, and what that knowledge is. Because the snake, because the reptiles are the oldest. That to me, that thought to me, has the kind of gestalt feeling of explanation that makes sense, that makes connections, that has a lesson in it that we can use in our lives. That's what I'm going to take away from this, and I'll continue to think about it. You know, I hope that I continue to run into other ideas. I'm not sure if this is the whole interpretation of what the snake is about, why it's evil in these earliest of origin stories or not, but that does make sense. Yeah, just one additional thought goes along with the revelation that I just personally had about the role of snakes in the early origin stories. Why is it the woman? Why is it the woman in the story that has this thing with the snake? When you look at the nature of women, the nature of women is can be very unforgiving. Women, when you do something bad to a woman in your relationship with the woman, she never lets it go. In that sense, women by their nature are kind of like often stuck in those histories, in those pasts, rather than in the moments. That might be just bullshit, but that was just an additional thought that came to me, and to me it rings true from my own experiences, but it may in fact not be, not really have anything to do with what the story is actually revealing. But to me that makes sense why it's the woman, because women are the ones with this nature. Women are the ones who don't let go of the past.